A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. On leaving the synagogue, Jesus entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Simon's mother-in-law lay sick with a fever. They immediately told him about her. He approached, grasped her hand, and helped her up. Then the fever left her, and she waited on them. When it was evening after sunset, they brought to him all who were ill or possessed by demons. The whole town was gathered at the door. He cured many who were sick with various diseases, and he drove out many demons, not permitting them to speak because they knew him. Rising very early before dawn, he left and went off to a deserted place where he prayed. Simon and those who were with him pursued him, and on finding him said, "Everyone is looking for you." He told them, "Let us go on to the nearby villages, that I may preach there also. For this purpose have I come." So he went into their synagogues, preaching and driving out demons throughout the whole of Galilee. The Gospel of the Lord.
On Friday morning, while reading the newspaper, I came across a letter written in the Ask Amy column, which I check out every once in a while. The letter was from a 60-year-old married woman who was seeking advice on how to deal with a very stressful situation going on in her life. She's the only daughter of an 88-year-old mother who resides in a nursing home. The daughter's brother lives far away, out of state, and other family members are estranged from this mother. So this daughter sees herself as her mom's only emotional support. The mother never interacts with the other residents and complains constantly, making life very difficult for the nursing home staff and for her daughter. Several visits a week from the daughter apparently are not good enough for mom. She complains about that. Thus, the daughter feels tremendous stress, even losing weight over the ordeal. And she feels growing bitterness, especially towards her mother. This letter highlights the theme of suffering, which is found in all of our readings today. The letter highlights social suffering, broken or strained relationships going on, plenty of emotional suffering for everybody involved, and physical suffering, implied by the mother's need for a nursing home and certainly the daughter's own physical concerns. Now, if you were the one to be asked for advice by the daughter in this letter, what would you suggest to her in dealing with these different kinds of suffering? Now, suffering is one of life's great mysteries. Many don't understand why we have it. And many people have wondered over the years, why do bad things happen to good people? If we have a God who is love and goodness itself, how can God allow suffering and evil in his created world? Well, we'll never have a complete answer to those kinds of questions in this lifetime, but we can make sense that suffering is necessary to some extent in human living. Every day we suffer from something, whether it's feeling hunger, or some kind of bodily pain, or anxiety, or some other need. And pain serves to alert us to the fact that something is wrong and needs healing, needs attention. And perhaps rest, or food, or medication, or reassuring presence and kind words can go a long way in easing mind, body, and spirit in somebody's life. You know, some suffering may be totally unavoidable, no matter how many precautions we take. Yet much suffering in our world is certainly needless and unnecessary. People often cause so much suffering in their own lives and in others' lives due to many different factors. For example, many health problems could be prevented and longer lives could be enjoyed with better diets, more sleep, sufficient amount of exercise, and avoiding dangerous habits like smoking, drinking alcohol, and drugs. And yet, sometimes we're born with bodily conditions that may inevitably lead to many health problems and limits. And that too is a part of suffering's great mystery. And yet, God still has great use for those who are considered weakest or sickest among us, because they can still inspire us in their condition. They can help us to be more grateful for the gifts that we enjoy. They teach us to embrace our mortality more. And they certainly can show us the beauty of God in many different ways. For example, think about those who have Down syndrome, retardation, or those who are confined to wheelchairs, maybe for the rest of their lives, or those who bravely face their cancer. And we all know somebody who's suffering with cancer, don't we? And you know, much suffering in this world is really due to plain old-fashioned hatred. Hatred of self, maybe hatred of other people, maybe both. And that gives rise to prejudice, crime, war, terrorism. And suffering also stems from bad decision-making, maybe due to ignorance, or due to selfishness, maybe immoral ambitions. And that's how people can ruin a heck of a lot of relationships, whether it's family relationships, maybe marriages, maybe ruin business plans, or other personal pursuits. Ask the Seattle Seahawks and their football fans about suffering. They can tell you a lot about that right now. It's going to be a long off-season. Think about it. The team was a minute away and a few inches from the goal line and a very likely Super Bowl victory. And most people would agree that they're choosing a passing play which was intercepted over a running play which had worked for them all day was one of the worst decisions not only in football history but in sports history. I hope they sleep well at night. I hope they learn well and heal. Quite often, people say things or do things which end up hurting a lot of other people, including themselves, whether it's intended or unintended. Jesus clearly teaches us throughout the Gospels that we need to be very careful about our words and actions, because once something is said or done, we cannot take it back, folks. We cannot erase the past. What's done is done. And they can take on lives of their own. And they can lead to good consequences or bad ones in the world around us and in our life's journey. But you know, the hope for us is that in the midst of any kind of suffering, God is right there with us. In the midst of any trial we go through. But do we recognize it? As the saying goes, faith is not true faith unless it's been tested, right? And we've all been tested to some degree or another. And maybe that's one of the main lessons from the book of Job, which offers our first reading today. It is a fictional story. It's not about a real person named Job. It's a fictional character that teaches us truths about how we look at the mystery of suffering in the world. A man named Job does a lot of complaining in this story, which may seem understandable if you remember what he went through. Now, here's as holy and good a person as you ever find, doing very well for himself. He's healthy and happy, he has a wife and kids, he's got plenty of land and livestock and many servants to support his livelihood. He seems to have it all together. And then suddenly everything changes. And his faith is suddenly shaken to its core. In one short period, he loses all of his livestock. His servants are all killed, most of them murdered by invaders. A windstorm destroys a house in which all of Job's children are in, and they die. And soon after, Job himself becomes ill, covered from head to toe with sores. painful existence, and you think you've had a bad day. Thus, it's no wonder that we hear Job say in today's first reading, "Is not man's life a drudgery? Isn't it a drag? My days come to an end without hope. I shall not see happiness again." End quote. Job doesn't understand it. It makes no sense whatsoever. He thought he did everything God asked him to do, and look at all this that's happening. But God gets it. He sees the bigger picture as to how all this plays its part. And you know what the miracle of the story is? That Job never completely loses faith in God. But his constant whining isn't helping either, is it? The story ends, as we all hope stories would end, happily ever after. God corrects Job in all of his whining and complaining, and he blesses Job with greater peace and prosperity than he ever had before. You know, as Christians, following what Jesus asked of us may not greatly reward us immediately or at all in this world, but it can lead to a treasure chest of peace and joy forever in the life to come in heaven, where suffering no longer exists. Isn't that what we all want? And you know, it takes a strong faith to hang on to that kind of hope. Do you have that kind of strong faith? You know what? Suffering sometimes can actually be good. Such as, think about exercising your bodies. No pain, no gain, right? Or perhaps you sacrifice something or your own bodily needs for your loved one's benefit. Or maybe, considering Lent is only a week and a half away, maybe fasting from certain things can not only benefit other people, but help you grow spiritually. Good food to think about for Lent coming up. And suffering can take on a greater meaning when it's endured for the right reasons, like standing up for peace and justice for somebody else who maybe is being abused or misused or neglected. And you know, St. Paul implies that in our second reading today in his letter, and he writes this, remember. "I have made myself a slave to all, to win over as many as possible. All this I do for the sake of the gospel." Now, we know that being a slave sounds bad to us, considering our country's not so pretty history with it. But Paul's way of using it is actually very good and spot on. Because when Paul's using it, he's saying, I consider other people around me more important than myself. And I freely decide to be a slave to Christ. That is, I'm going to live my whole life to following what Jesus wants, not what I want. Because if I go by my ways, I'm going to muck it all up. But if I go by Jesus' way, it's going to be a glorious road. And Paul says basically he is willing to endure all these kinds of hardships of rejection and spittings and beatings and mockery and imprisonment and even death. Sound familiar? Because Jesus went through all those things. And why would he do it? Because he hopes that example of being Jesus to others is going to bring people to seeing God's way of doing things, not their own selfish intentions. That's what a true Christian is willing to do. How about you? What are you willing to suffer for out of your love for Jesus? How can you prove your love to Jesus? That's Paul's challenge to us today through this letter. You know, at this very moment, all around our state, all around our country, all around our world, there are people who are suffering who don't have to. For example, there is plenty of food and clean water for the whole world to share and enjoy, and yet many don't have access to such things because of injustices galore. Whether it's bad governmental policies, the selfishness of many rich citizens who don't like sharing that much, theft and other crimes, or maybe, folks, just plain indifference by many people who could give a darn about the plight of the poor. They just don't care. Maybe that's a challenge for us. Do we care? You may not be aware of the fact that today on the church's calendar is the National Day of Prayer against human trafficking. which is peoples enslaving other people to do their bidding, usually to make money for themselves, but it goes beyond that. It's more about control, it's about disrespect, it's about hatred, ultimately. Hatred of humans. Did you know that back as of 2012, according to the United Nations International Labor Organization, there were almost 21 million people in the world who were living basically as slaves? And it's estimated that 1.5 million of that number are living that way right in our own country, as well as in Canada and Europe. More than a fourth of that 21 million figure, guess how old they are? 17 years old or younger. Horrible. And they were drawn in either by means of kidnapping, coercion, or false promises of saying, oh, I'll give you money, I'll give you a job, I'll give you education, I'll even show you love. Come and do my way. They suckered them in, and they got them, hook, line, and sinker. So they could serve in things like factories, farms, and hotels, to prostitution rings, and even private residences. Clearly, this goes against everything that Jesus stands for, folks. Yet how many people know about it, let alone they're doing something about it? In our diocese this weekend, it's Public Policy Weekend, when we're being asked to sign petitions to fight against a specific injustice in our state. And we hope that after Mass, you will sign a petition to be sent to Albany to promote the health and livelihood of women throughout New York State in various ways, including the following: fighting human trafficking, preventing job discrimination against pregnant women, and that happens all too often, ending various forms of discrimination against parents in the workplace, battling sexual harassment at job sites, and stopping legislation which would expand state abortion laws to just about any reason to have an abortion and at any stage of the child's development in the mother's womb, including 9 months. This is all part of the legislation that is known as the Women's Equality Act. And there are information sheets on the tables at the exits where these petitions are located. So our New York State bishops and numerous states' women's groups pray that you will support these pieces of legislation which will help to ease and prevent much suffering among so many in our state right now. Final thoughts. Only with the power of Christ's help can we ever hope to overcome any kind of suffering in our life. We can do nothing good without God behind it. We are never once alone in our suffering, even though sometimes it may feel like it. Job found that out. We are all called through our baptism to be just like Jesus was and is in the gospel, to reach out to the sick and the needy, to heal the brokenhearted, as we heard in the psalm, and to help people recognize more clearly the love and respect that God has for all of his wondrous creation. And as the old Diana Ross song goes, way back in 1970, we're going to test your age now. Reach out and touch somebody's hand. Make this world a better place if you can. My apologies to Diana Ross, but you get the point, right? That's our common mission, folks, towards our common goal. To walk with one another and help one another as a community towards the light of heavenly peace, where sin and suffering are history. God bless you all.